For every flower that opens in your garden, another wound is healed in your heart. This garden was created in honor of all our precious children who will live forever in our hearts. May your time in this place bring you peace. Welcome. Hello, my new friends and guests of the Apache Behavioral Health Center. I am thrilled and delighted to be with you for this annual conference 2021. My name is Reverend Laura Biddle. I am standing here in front of a garden in our church yard, and this garden is dedicated to children who have died. Every plant is dedicated to a child. We have bricks in the walkway, all dedicated to children who have died. This is a garden kept up and maintained by the Compassionate Friends of Manchester, New Hampshire, which is where I am speaking to you and with you. I'm very honored to be asked to be your guide for this time of healing and hope. The title of your program, the program that is run by the Apache Behavioral Health Center, is Life is Precious. In some ways, just that title hooked me in, and I said, I would love to work with you this year for this conference. It is one of my favorite phrases that I use with people in spiritual counseling, especially people who are grieving suicide. The idea that life is precious, the one who has died by suicide, and those left behind who are grieving. Grief after suicide is unfathomable grief. It is painful. It comes at us, not to us. And it is an overwhelming grief. It's filled with all sorts of feelings that we sometimes run away from, such as fear, regret, guilt, anxiety. So when we're grieving suicide, we often just try not to feel, or we look for ways to just feel better as soon as possible. Come on, let's get this going. And people actually say that to us. All right, let's move on. Especially people who don't understand that grief after suicide connects us not just to one another, but to the people we love who have died by suicide. So I am here because I have lost several people in my own life to suicide, and as a minister, I have done many funerals for people who have died by suicide. And I've learned that in this healing process that sometimes begins at a funeral or a memorial service, in this healing process, we take shame out of the way. We lift ourselves from any kind of apologies necessary for the suicide and realize that the one who has died by suicide is a beloved child of all that is holy. The one who has died by suicide was in so much unfathomable pain that suicide was finally the only way to deal with the pain. So I am here to say that we are in this together, you and I, and if you come with some shame about suicide, someone you know who has died, or even just the idea of suicide, people often will say, oh, how selfish. Well, I would like to say I don't agree with that at all. I do not believe suicide is a selfish act. Dying by suicide is often seen by the one who has taken their own life as a way of setting other people free, which is not a selfish act at all. let me also add, I do not promote suicide. I believe wholeheartedly that when we grieve well, the grief and trauma after a suicide, which we call postvention in the world of suicide healing, when we grieve well in postvention, we do really good prevention work. So today, while I will be talking about grief and ways that we can come together, I do believe that we are also talking about prevention. As we begin, and we have this premise of life is precious with us, I'd like to start with a prayer. I will do my best to be inclusive of all people. Though I am a Christian minister, I am not here to talk about Christianity. I'm here to talk about the spiritual realm and our relationship with those we love who have died by suicide. Let us pray. O gracious and loving God, you who give birth and join us at that moment, and you who also know about how hard it is sometimes to live in this life, to suffer, to see other people suffer, to be witnesses to trauma, to be witnesses to suicide. You know how difficult life can be, and I trust wholeheartedly that when we die, no matter how we die or where we die or with whom we die or what age we die, you join us with love, welcoming us into your holy realm. And I trust, O God, that we, those left behind, those who are grieving, those who are wondering about how this can happen, suicide, that you are here to teach us about being open-minded and open-hearted. You are here to help us heal alone and together, to connect us as a compassionate community, and to be leaders in the field of compassion for those who are considering suicide, for those who have taken their lives, and for those of us who are grieving the depths of grief after a suicide. Join us, I pray, join the hearts and minds of all the people that are tuning into this workshop today, and remind us often as we need, that you are here, you are near, and we are loved unconditionally. Amen. So I'm sort of a storyteller, so I'm gonna tell the story about 3 suicide families, suicide situations. But before I do, I want to just lay the groundwork for my beliefs about suicide, because I think it's important that you know what I believe. What I believe is people die by suicide. They do not commit suicide. We distinguish between those 2 ways of talking about suicide because commit assumes some kind of crime. We commit murder. But suicide is something very different than committing. Suicide is a way of taking one's own life and sadly leaving a community of people, a family of loved ones behind who just don't understand. But nobody sees it as a crime. That's a judgment, and we're not here to judge. Second, I believe that postvention, which is what we are talking about today, it's the work that I do as a grief counselor. Postvention is one of the best preventions. To prevent is to understand, to be with, to have peers that talk about suicide, that talk about the people who have died by suicide, and who grieve together by piecing together the puzzle that's left behind. And there is always a puzzle left behind. after suicide. 3, grief and trauma are always linked in postvention work after suicide, because we, as people surviving suicide, are traumatized. So while we are dealing with grief, we are also dealing with post-trauma. Every story, number 4, is unique. Every grief story is unique. Every suicide story is unique. And every grief journey is based on the relationship between the one who has died and the one who lives on. No one can should us into a style of grieving. No one can tell us that seeing signs of the person we love who has died is impossible. No one can should us in the way we grieve and the time we use to grieve, because your grief is unique to you and your neighbor's grief, and their style of grieving and their timing of grieving is totally unique to them. So we now become this community of people agreeing that as we grieve, there is no judgment, there is no shame. 5, love never dies. Now, I believe that a garden tells that truth as beautifully as anything else. Love never dies. The gardener, that great spirit, Holy One, the gardener makes sure that every year when the weather is good and the soil is ready, that the vine that surges through life makes room for branches and for flowers and for fruit. And it is a sign that love never dies. So here in the garden, we are going to go on that premise that love never dies, the spiritual promise that is woven through our earth and through our lives. And finally, number 6, this new relationship that we have with the one who has died by suicide, I call it the new relationship, has 2 requirements for those of us left behind, for those of us who are grieving. And the first requirement is an open mind. We take away judgment, we take away preconceived notions, we take away what other people have told us is right or wrong. And the second requirement is an open heart. Now this is a little harder in some ways than an open mind, because hearts are broken. Grief is about love that hurts because our hearts are broken. But as we open our hearts, we make room for the light that is healing and hopeful. And without that crack, without that opening, there is no room for the healing light. And so today, let's begin our time with some stories of mine, and hopefully you can relate, with open minds and open hearts, trusting in the power of the healing spirit among us. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself so you understand why I'm here. For many years, right after a seminary, which is where one goes to study to be an ordained minister, which I am, I was called, which is a way of trusting that God is guiding us. In my field, we call it a calling or a call. I was called to work with women in prison in Massachusetts, and I did that work for about 13 years. That's where I started my ordained ministry. And in the time of that ministry with women in prison, I experienced suicides. It's more in retrospect that I understand what it was that I was working with. But that was where my journey with suicide began. I specifically remember 3 women who were tested positive for HIV. And at the time, there wasn't a clear understanding of how HIV is spread. It was early on in that time. And so people thought that perhaps by feeding other people, by feeding children, they might contract HIV. And so these 3 women I'm referring to, living in prison where they found out that they were HIV positive and their positivity was due to intravenous drug use, they panicked about returning home to their children. And so, in all 3 cases, when they were released from prison, after they'd spent a little bit of time with their children, loving them with their whole heart, they took their own lives as a way to protect their children. Sadly, we know now that there was no need, that their children were not going to contract this disease by eating food that mom cooked or living in the same space that mom lived in. But at the time, they didn't know, and quite honestly, I didn't know. So I did the funerals for these 3 women, and my heart was just kind of ripped out of my body. I had worked with them before they left the prison, and here we were on that freedom journey, that freedom ride that we'd worked so hard to achieve, to get to, and out of fear, they took their own lives. So that's where my story begins with suicide. But those are not the stories I'm going to tell you about today. There are 3 stories that I want to share that really have created in me a desire to be a grief counselor with a specialty in being with and accompanying people who are grieving suicide. So the first suicide I want to talk to you about is John. John was a Marine in our United States military. He had 2 children and a wife. His wife's name is Kim. And John had been flying with the Marines for several years. I think it might be as many as 10 before he was deployed once again and on his way back to Iraq. And at Fort Pendleton in California, John took his own life. And it happened a little oddly. Kim and the children were home. They were watching the Super Bowl, and Kim got a call from John. And in the call, it seemed that John was not himself. And he said something to Kim that made her think, he needs me right away. Now, of course, suicide wasn't a possibility, because for those of us who are grieving, generally speaking, it isn't a possibility. We haven't even fathomed that as something that could happen. So Kim got on a plane from Massachusetts to Fort Pendleton, and arrived to find out that John had indeed taken his life. And she was not allowed to see him. She was not allowed to even go near his room. And given the wrong information from an ordained clergy person who said, "Your husband is not here. He is in hell." Kim and I met that next day at her home in Massachusetts, and when she told me that, I said, there is no truth to that. That is nowhere in our scriptures. That is not true. The one who has died by suicide is welcomed into the holy realm of the Holy Spirit, the Great Spirit, and there is no judgment, and there certainly is no sentence to hell. But Kim had heard this, so she was traumatized, not only by her husband's suicide, that of course she had no clue about, but then by these words spoken at the the place of his death. So she was upstairs when I arrived at the house in bed. And her children were there with their cousins and friends downstairs, not knowing what had happened, although knowing that John was dead. And so I spoke a little bit with them, not bringing up the word suicide at all, because we had not talked about that yet or made a decision about how we would talk with children about it. And then I went up to be with Kim, and I sat down, as ministers often do. I sat down on the side of the bed and I rubbed her hand and I said, "Would you like me to say a prayer?" And Kim became enraged and she yelled, "No!" I had no idea what had happened at the scene of the suicide, so I knew that I was to be still, that I was to wait. And so I just lay down beside Kim and I put my arms around her and we just wept together. And then finally, after about an hour, I believe, of that, at least that's the way Kim and I tell the story, I said, we need to say something to God. So let's just shake our fists in the air and say, what happened here? And so that became our prayer together through 2 years of weekly grief counseling after suicide. Kim's trauma, Kim's post-traumatic stress, PTS, was extreme. She and her children didn't know what to do. I worked with them for a little while. Nobody knew whether you tell them it is suicide, whether you explain anything that actually happened. And so we got to a place where we realized it was very important that the children knew the truth. And we learned this from an organization called TAPS, Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, where Kim Ruako became the suicide coordinator and director for the grief programs. And for children, they offered what we called Good Grief Camp. And in the Good Grief Camps, we made sure that children were okay with talking about the one who died by suicide, and were okay with using the word suicide, and were okay with saying, my dad or my mom or my cousin or my brother or my sister died by suicide. And as time went on, Kim's 2 children have been very involved in the suicide grief world and in being present with other children who have lost someone to suicide. Kim's post-traumatic stress became what we now call in postvention work post-traumatic growth. She got involved with TAPS. She started speaking to many, many people who had lost military family members to suicide. And she created a program with TAPS that really was a sign of post-traumatic growth. So I end there by saying that I have learned also to call what I'm doing now my post-traumatic growth, because after a suicide, all you can feel is post-traumatic stress, and you think, this is it, this is the end, I'm going to just live in this place forever. And yet, because we allow ourselves to feel, because we allow ourselves to be present to one another, and to be open-minded and open-hearted about our healing, lo and behold, we discover post-traumatic growth. For me, it looks like grief counseling, loving families and individuals through their grief after suicide. My second story is about Walter. Walter was my oldest and best friend. He and I believe, met when we were in 5th grade. And somehow our lives just kept intertwining right from then on until he died in 2011. He was my dearest friend, the friend I was most frustrated with sometimes, the friend who showed up every time I needed him, the friend that held me and loved me, and the friend that I occasionally totally didn't understand. But he was a friend, the kind of friend you trust with everything. In 2011, I had gone out on a vacation to the West Coast. I was in Oregon, where I rented a motorcycle. Yes, indeed, I am a motorcycle rider, and I love to ride a motorcycle. I rented a motorcycle out in Oregon, and I rode through the most amazing highways and byways in Oregon that I've ever seen in my life. And on my return, where I felt totally centered and totally calm and totally alive in my own skin and in my soul, I was driving my car from the airport to my house when my phone rang. And it was Walter's father, also named Walter. And he said, "Can you pull over by the side of the road?" So I did. And I knew something was wrong. And he said, "Walter has died, and we were wondering if you would do his funeral." Well, just those 2 sentences were a lot for me to take in. Walter, my beloved Walter, had died, and I was being asked to do my beloved's friend's funeral, to which I said, of course. And then I asked, I think the obvious question, how did he die? And there was a pause. And then his dad said, he killed himself. And that changed everything about my grief. The idea that my beloved Walter would be in so much pain, pain that I didn't know existed in him, pain that I didn't see, that at the last time we went out to dinner and had sushi together, I was totally unaware. My beloved Walter took his own life. In preparation for leading the funeral, which was for me probably a huge pivotal moment in my life, because I knew a lot of people that were there. Everyone there, over 400 people, were young, except for his parents' family. We were flabbergasted. Our mouths were just on the floor together. And it was my job, because I had spoken with the family ahead of time, that we would talk about suicide in this funeral, that we would allow Walter's suicide to be a kind of coming together of minds and hearts, of building a compassionate community that A, knew something about suicide, that beloved friends, beloved family members can take their lives, and B, that we can talk about this. We can do something about it by not being timid and afraid to step into the story, to tell the story, to remind people that love never dies, and most importantly, to cry together, which we did throughout that funeral. My relationship with Walter didn't die that day. He was the one who taught me how to ride a motorcycle, which is kind of an ironic thing, knowing that I had just come back from an amazing motorcycle ride in Oregon. And every time I get on my motorcycle, which I did 2 weeks ago with my 90-year-old father on his motorcycle, riding through the hills and mountains of Vermont, every time I get on that motorcycle, which I do know is a dangerous weapon to ride, I'm extremely cautious, but I also always tie a bandana around my neck, because Walter was known for his bandanas. And I tie a bandana around my neck and I say, okay, Walt, we're going for a ride today. And I trust 100% that Walter joins me, maybe not as a guardian angel, but certainly as a companion through thick and thin, through terrible weather, through rocky roads, through dirt roads. Walter joins me when I take a ride on my motorcycle. So that's where I want to bring up this idea of, in post-traumatic growth, we begin to see signs of this new relationship, the relationship between ourselves, still here, rooted in the garden of life, with the one who has died, who is in that spiritual realm, maybe 2 inches away from us at any given time. So I believe that Kim and her children experienced their father and husband John in that very near and dear way, every day, all day. And I know for sure that I experience my relationship with Walter in that very near and dear way, every day, anytime I call his name and tell his story. And finally, the third story I want to tell you, because it's equally important to me, is the story of young David, 26-year-old David, who took his life. David was training to join his father as a police officer in a local police station, and he'd gone through much of the training and he was ready to take the tests necessary, and he had, unbeknownst to both his parents, purchased a gun. And 3 weeks after he purchased the gun, he didn't come home after a shift at work. And then his mother received a phone call from his work saying, David never arrived to work last night, and it's not like him. He's so responsible. He always calls when he can't be here. And mother and father immediately knew something was terribly wrong. And father, who is a police officer, went out searching for where in the world would David be. And he decided that perhaps he'd be at a place that he loved, which was his gym. He loved working out at a local gym. And so Dad, the police officer, rode to the gym. And there in the gym parking lot was David's car. And in the car was David, who had died by suicide. The agony of this family, the unbearable torment of this family, having no idea that their beloved child, their beautiful child, might feel so lost and in so much pain that he would take his life. And so my work with them began that week, in fact. Word of mouth brought them to me because they knew that I knew something about grief after suicide. And we have been together for 3 years weekly, talking about David, praying about David, and in fact, in my backyard, I have a garden that is a grief garden in memory of many of the people I work with. And David has a corner in my memory garden where flowers bloom every year, reminding us all that love never dies, and that this life spirit that connects us, maybe 2 inches apart, from real life on earth to real life in the spiritual realm. And so David is very much alive in my world, and particularly in the world of his parents. But let me also say that it's been over 3 years that we have been doing grief work together, and the many, many times that they have received messages from religious institutions, from people in all kinds of religious scenarios saying, okay, come on, it's time to get over this and get on with your life. And in fact, there is no getting on with this. There is no getting over this. Suicide grief is forever. When we can trust that the relationship didn't die, when we can be open-minded and open-hearted to the signs of life everlasting, we can move forward, not getting over or even trying to get through. We can move forward, trusting that the one we love is near, maybe just 2 inches apart, and that love didn't die, and that this relationship is now an offering, a gift, to help us understand that when someone dies by suicide, though we don't want to be these people, we are connected to others of the same kind of loss. And together, we become people who prevent suicide. Not because we're trained in it, not because we have all the right things to say, but because we trust one another. We are hand in hand in this story, and we will never stop talking about it, and we will never shame ourselves or other people about it, because we love, and because the relationship with the one who has died by suicide did not end. So you and I, my friends, are now a new compassionate community. Whether you are grieving suicide or you know someone who is, whether you have gone through your life thinking that this somehow is a sin, and now you know because the one you love who died by suicide wasn't a sinner. You, my friends, and I have joined the cadre of people who are doing suicide prevention work together because we grieve, because we talk about our feelings, because we keep our loved ones alive in our hearts and in our minds, and because we are connected through all of this. Good grief after suicide is preventative. We can do this. We can prevent suicide by wrapping our arms around one another, by seeing and hearing somebody else's truth and not calling the police or doing something radical, but just saying, talk to me. And then ask, and I know some of you are assist trained, ask the important question: who do you love that you can turn to? Now, sometimes who we love is someone who has died, and that's a really legitimate answer. I would call perhaps on Walter, although I've had many suicides in my own family, and so I do call on other people as well. So who do I call on? But also there are friends. I would call on Kim, because she and I have this common bond. I would call on the parents of David and other people who I know who have lost children or loved ones to suicide. And now, I might call on you, and you might call on each other, because we are now a brand new community, prepared to step into this world hand in hand, trusting in the healing power of the healing spirit that lives among us, that rises in us, and that is always present to us. My final words to you would be to be gentle with yourself and one another, to listen, to understand without judgment, to ask questions, to understand, to know more, to learn what you need to know, and to step into the world more compassionate than ever, prepared to share your story and to hear the story of others. And finally, to trust this idea of post-traumatic grief becoming post-traumatic growth, because you're in it, because you are honest in it, because you are together, not because you're pretending or shaming yourself about anything. Post-trauma is real. It feels like a panic attack when it happens. And if we cannot be gentle with ourselves, accepting what is now, then we can't do the work of prevention. So be a postvention community heading in the direction of post-traumatic growth as you live into your name. Life is precious. Please join me for a prayer as we close out our time together. O God of ultimate wisdom, of human hope and desire, of spirits rising and also falling, we ask you to be here with each one of us as we take what is such a solo journey in grief, as we take the next step, the only one we can take, moving towards hope and towards healing ourselves and healing our community, and trusting that the healing work of those who have died by suicide is very much available to each one of us if we can trust in the power of your healing spirit, here, always, coming always, lifting us up and offering us the resilience to rise again and to rise again. May God bless each one of you, each one of us. Amen. Thank you.